Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's LexisNexis Reed Tech webinar, eCTD version 4.0, the future of regulatory submissions. Before we get started with today's webinar, we wanted to just go through a few quick logistics in case you're not familiar with the GoToWebinar platform. This is a live recording, so you're all muted, but if you have any technical difficulties or any questions, please enter them in the chat box. I will try to help you resolve any technical difficulties just as quickly as possible. And any questions, we will have an expert from our team follow up with you after today's webinar. Additionally, you can expect to receive the slides and a video link by email either later today or later this week. Our speakers today are 3 Reed Tech subject matter experts. We have Adrienne Outerfer, our Associate Director of Regulatory Operations, Jim Hilferty, our Head of Business Transformation, and Gary Sainer, our Senior Regulatory Principal on the Life Sciences team here at Reed Tech. Today, Adrienne, Jim, and Gary are going to give you an overview of the current shifts and changes in the eCTD landscape, moving from version 3.2.2 to version 4.0. Specifically, they'll look at key changes, the benefits of adopting eCTD version 4.0, and the implementation timeline. Now, before we kick off the presentation, we were hoping to ask you a few quick questions to just gauge the current knowledge level of our audience. So the first question that we'll ask, if you don't mind filling this out, is has your company started the optional eCTD version 4.0 implementation process? You'll see your choices right there on the screen, yes, no, or not sure. So we'll leave this open for about another 10 seconds or so, give everyone a chance to vote, so our speakers can kind of tailor the presentation a little bit to see what we're dealing with here. Okay, it does look like mostly everyone has voted, so we're going to go ahead and close that poll. And just to give you a quick peek, it looks like about 20% of people have started, a little over 60% have not, and about 20% are not sure. So moving on from there, we wanted to ask, if you have not started yet, where are you in the thought process about implementing version 4.0? So the options you'll see there on your screen: not yet started, need guidance, actively researching, starting implementation, or not sure. Again, we'll leave this open for a few more seconds so everyone has the opportunity to vote. We really appreciate you all taking part in these polls so that we can really make sure the presentation is as valuable as possible for y'all. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll now, and I will share the results quickly. It looks like an overwhelming percentage are actively researching. So that's great. That's what we're here to help you with today, learn more about this topic. So with that, Adrienne, would you mind kicking the presentation off?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Erin. So for those of you that joined us for our first webinar regarding eCTD as a whole, these boxes may look familiar to you. We did introduce the idea of eCTD 4.0 at the end of that webinar. So the focus of today's webinar is to really take a deep dive into each one of these different components, main components to eCTD 4.0 changes. They are document reuse, management of context groups, document and metadata lifecycle, the harmonization of XML, and changes to the ICH structure. Okay, great. So the first one that we're going to take a look into is document reuse. And this is important because it really promotes a standardization and streamlines the regulatory review process, and it helps reduce errors by ensuring that the same document is not, used multiple times and is consistently used across different submissions. So Gary's really going to help us look into that by exploring what is the difference in document reuse between 4.0 and 3.2.2.
Sure. Well, it's always very helpful to be able to make use of a document you've already loaded, and there's a lot of legacy use of internal references to documents that have been loaded, and you use it at different places in the narrative and point to it. The particular scenario that we're talking about here is being able to reuse documents that are in a different application. So 3.2.2 supported that, but it was a little bit troublesome. The particular pathway that you might have in your environment when you do your local publishing might work fine, and yet when the application is opened by a reviewer, say at the FDA, now that particular environment might be different. Pathway is not the same as your local pathway, and now the link is going to be a dead link, and you won't be able to do the referencing. So for that reason, it was a little troublesome. It had probably limited use, wasn't fully encouraged, but it was possible. But now with 4.0, that particular linking to reusing documents, not only internally but into external applications, becomes so much easier and much more deterministic. The reason for that is because those particular files now have unique identifiers, and you can point to those identifiers multiple times throughout application A and point to a file in application B that was submitted earlier. So that becomes much more powerful, easy to use. In addition to that, not only are you able to point to a particular file, but you're also able to point to a section of a file. So if you just want a paragraph or a couple pages, not the whole particular document that you want to refer to, you're able to point to that and use that as a reference. So that greatly increases the flexibility and makes it much more confident. You are much more confident in having that particular link work. So that includes the traceability, where you're able to now very confidently determine what document referring to, and making sure that the reader, reviewer is able to open up that related document.
Okay, great. So thank you for that, Gary. How does document versioning come into play with the new document reuse policy?
Jim, do you want to jump in there and talk a little bit about the versioning?
All right. Hopefully I'm unmuted now. You guys hear me?
There you go.
All right. It was bound to happen, right? So yeah, I'll take that. Thank you very much. So document versioning, because we're really dealing with document IDs here with 4.0, it's great as far as referencing is concerned, but if you kind of look at it in reverse, it throws the challenge in the other direction. So now that you really have to pay, I think, probably more attention from the content management standpoint to ensure that you really do know which documents and their context of use throughout different applications, since you can reference them not only by ID from within an application, but from another one too as well. So really understanding where your live document is, so to say, that it can be active across multiple applications, I would say really becomes key here. The flexibility that you're now gaining from the use of the ID in the document is great from the eCTD standpoint and the referencing, but I just wanted to bring that forward, is that where focus really kind of comes into now is making sure you have a good understanding of where a particular document is being used across different submissions, so that way you have the correct amount of collaboration when it comes to changes, where changes in a particular piece of content that's being shared is a change that's relevant to the things being shared. So a lot of those challenges we didn't necessarily see with 3.2, as in most content across submissions and applications tended to be copies. Whereas here, since you have the ability to reference those files by ID, you really end up with having to do a little bit more due diligence on the front side of managing your content.
Okay, great. Thank you both for that explanation. So the next major category of changes we have is regarding management of context groups. So in doing so, managing these context groups enables a more organized and efficient way to categorize and reference your regulatory information. It enables easier navigation and retrieval of documents. So there are several main reasons why these are important, and Gary's going to help us explore the advantages of context groups as they relate to eCTD 4.0.
Yeah, the context group is a nice new concept where you're able to identify a particular group of documents, and you probably have scenarios where you put multiple documents in a particular folder, and and you kind of wish that you had the ability to group some of them, not only for your own use and understanding of what you have in there and what you have covered, but also for the reviewer to help them understand the actual content of those files. So going beyond the actual file title, now there's this concept of a concept group. So you're able to put an identifier on a particular group of files and basically create a little subfolder, if you will. So the example that we have here, manufacturer, would be those particular context groups. And you see an additional identifier behind the manufacturer in this case. So you may have been familiar with attributes for sure in 3.22. Now there's a controlled vocabulary referred to as key words. So these key words are used to help identify that particular file, and they come from a controlled vocabulary. So that makes it very standardized. You're able to pick a particular characteristic and use that keyword to identify that file. And the reviewer now has a controlled vocabulary list to understand and be able to very quickly pick up that particular keyword. Now, there is the ability to create new keywords, custom keywords that you define. So once you do that, obviously you want to keep that standardized inside an application, ideally across applications, and that becomes a paired set. So the paired set of the key word, whether it be the controlled vocabulary or custom one, matched up with the context group becomes a paired set. You manage that together. There is this ability to rename documents and context groups. So once you have that in place, something may change. You have another supplement being submitted and things are now reorganized in a different fashion, and you may need to go back and rename. So that's all capability inside 4.0, being able to rename those contact groups and the documents as well in those key terms. So Adrian?
Great. Thank you for the explanation of context groups. It will be an important concept to understand as we move forward into our next category of document metadata lifecycle. As Jim will explain here in just a moment, the context groups are an important part of that. So there are numerous changes to lifecycle management capabilities in 4.0. They allow for better tracking and management throughout their lifecycle. It also facilitates easier updates, amendments, withdrawals, and also improves just overall compliance and efficiency, which in the end to the sponsors results in time and cost savings. So Jim, could you explain what the enhanced lifecycle management capabilities are and how it benefits regulatory operations?
Sure, Adrian. Happy to do that. So with the addition of context groups and the shift from attributes that are predefined to the use of keywords that could be redefined or also defined as needed, you end up with a lot more flexibility to kind of counter some of the, I would say, some of the regional differences that we started to see within the applications. So specifically, for instance, with the U.S., with the study tagging files coming into play, basically the need to be able to group a bunch of clinical study reports and put them in a particular order. So you see the synopsis and then the body of the document and then your appendices. So that was, if you really kind of think about a study tagging file, that's what it was an additional XML requirement for the U.S. in order to group together a clinical study and put the documents in a particular order. So when we look at some of the examples you see in this slide, you're seeing not only some flexibility coming in with 4.0 at the document level, but you're also seeing the ability of it to handle the complexity of grouping documents that previously required additional XML to be provided. So in the first example to the left is a good example of being able to start off with one document and then replace it with multiple pieces, and then the one in the middle moves to multiple pieces being replaced by one document. This is a level of flexibility that wasn't there in 3.2. So basically how you submitted it, you continued, and if you wanted to make that change, you'd have to withdraw all those documents and then resubmit them. Here you have the ability to go ahead and replace that. But as the example on the far right shows, we're still restricted by the context of that. So for instance, you wouldn't just move some content from one drug product to another drug product in 3.2.2. You wouldn't really do the same thing here in that concept of thinking of the context group being the drug product itself. So you can't really just kind of replace and move from one group to the other. That's more of a complicated move that's handled much more similar to how it used to be done in the 3.2 world. But you end up with a lot of flexibility here of being able to group documents together as well as order them, which becomes really nice because, again, now you can solve that study tagging file problem that was being solved by the SDF of saying the synopsis is document number 1, the body is document number 2, 16.1 is document number 3, etc., and moving on. So you can put things in an order and you can give it a context group and say I'm clinical study report 1, 2, 3. So there's all sorts of information now that it's flexible to be able to provide that structure without it being predefined the way it was in the 3.2 world, which really deals with a lot of pains that we did see as far as being able to manage things like typos or being able to put documents into a particular order for our reviewers. And as we move forward with the adoption of 4.0, hopefully we'll see more consolidation, regionally speaking, on, for instance, the difference with the EU looking to have your node extensions to group files together. They would effectively now become context groups in the same way that the SPLs would then become a context group. So this gives you the ability for us to see some more consolidation from some of those regional differences that we saw come into play through the existence of eCTD up until the present point.
Great, thanks, Jim. So
Sure.
in the lines of combining things and making them more streamlined, we move on to the harmonization of the XML file, which I feel like is one of the biggest changes that eCTD 4.0 will bring. And it is the adoption of a single global XML across all structures and formats for different regulatory agencies. It will promote consistency by reducing submission errors and standardizing the data. So Jim, how does a single global XML message in eCTD 4.0 for regulatory submissions accomplish standardizing structures and formats?
Sure. I'll get into that a little bit. So kind of bouncing off the last slide that we went over with the additional flexibility within structuring the content within the XML, that naturally leads to being able to just have one submission message now called submission unit.xml, where previously we had our index.xml, which covered your common modules, and you had your regional XML that covered module 1, and then again, example in the US, you could have your SPL file, you could have your STF file, so more and more XML files could be required, your defined file. You end up with all sorts of different pieces of XML coming in order to essentially accomplish the goal of grouping files together, putting an order to them, and providing some structured data about them. So now with the new 4.0 specifications and their flexibility through the context groups, the context of use, combining context groups effectively with keywords, you have the ability to really meet all those needs that birthed the multiple XML files before. So now with the new singular file and the flexible formatting, we can accommodate those regional differences all in one submission message. So this really adds to simplicity as far as keeping up with the different changes across the regions and having to consume, for instance, software that changes that accommodate a new DTD that came out from a particular region at any given time. So we end up with that flexibility really streamlining things. It makes it more efficient. It's obviously interoperable across all these different regions once they start to come and adopt it. it's definitely flexible, and we really feel like this will facilitate better compliance over the years as more adoption comes, and really it has the ability to accommodate what we've seen in the past, the different variances across. So it's a lot simpler. There's other changes too as well that maybe we can get into some detail later on, like structure. I believe we have a slide coming up here, so we'll kind of dig into the structure a little bit more. But for the most part, it really kind of just simplifies the amount of technical files we have to generate because of the flexibility of the one file we now do. I think you ended up on mute, Adrian, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, that brings us to the changes in the ICH structure. So as you mentioned, the removal of the util folder flattened the main root folder somewhat, but there are additional changes, to the 2 through 5 as well. So Jim, do you want to speak to us about that?
Yeah, so I'll touch up on a few of these things. So now that the regional information can be handled in your submission unit XML, you no longer have to provide that. We are already seeing some slight differences there in just the organization. So the US is coming out and saying, okay, just inside of M1, you can drop all your M1 files and you don't need a separate folder called US. However, you are seeing Japan still looking for that folder, subfolder called JP. So we are seeing a little bit of structural differences being asked for within these, but for the most part, it's becoming a lot more simple. So instead of digging all the way into, 3.2.p.4. Whatever, you're not seeing that. You're just seeing 3.2.p. So all the files can reside in there. And really, the reason why, because all this information that we were previously gathering from the actual physical structure, so the XML itself was sort of structuring your way to the information associated with the file. It was inheriting from the structure. Now that information is being associated directly with the file via the context of use, the keywords. So the extra structure isn't necessary anymore in order to gather the same structured information. So you meet the same means to the end with getting rid of a few different problems that we've experienced throughout the decades when it comes to eCTD. Before your attributes would affect your naming of your file folder, and you'd end up with the structure sometimes if you had, for instance, a very long indication that would break your 256 character limit. You'd end up with PDF file names getting truncated or not publishing properly, or not being viewed properly, not being imported by a new tool properly. So there was a lot of sort of implications that happened by the structure and being relied on to provide metadata. So now that we can provide all that through the grouping of the XML and 4.0, as well as the metadata associated with any given piece of content, we can much more cleanly handle in sort of a flat way, from a folder taxonomy standpoint, all the information that's needed for your common, your quality, your non-clinical, and your clinical study reports.
Okay, thank you. So the next slide that we have here is just kind of a summary of everything that we just spoke about, the main categories and a few highlights that we've identified in each area that you can use for a reference tool later. So the next slide, Gary, please. All the items that we just talked about are part of what I would consider the phase 1 of eCTD 4.0. It hasn't formally been referred to as phase 1, but because there's been talks of additional items to come as part of later rollouts of 4.0, some of this information is a little bit harder to find, but we were able to find some research on these 2 additional changes regarding transition of current applications and two-way communication. So Jim does have a little bit more insight into these items that he can briefly fill us in on.
Sure. So a couple of things. The transition from 3.2 to 4.0, there's a lot of detail there. And here at Reed Tech, we're happy to have a conversation with anybody who wants to get into some of the detail, but I'll just touch on a few of the big points here. The first one being, once you go to version 4, you're in version 4. This is very similar with any of the previous transitions. So don't jump on that until you're ready to fully commit to it. And as mentioned earlier, and we have another slide coming up with some sort of challenges, you just need to make sure that you're aware of some of these challenges when it comes to understanding what document IDs now do for you on the positive and the challenging side before you go ahead and jump into that transition. A couple other things to mention is that, basically you do provide the last eCTD sequence that you did under 3 once you go to 4. And at that point, everything kind of gets migrated into version 4, and then you're good to go there. So it's quite simple from that process, moving things forward. When you grab your new sequence number, you're moving to whole numbers, which is another change. Instead of 0003 was your last one, your next one's going to be 4. So, you have some small changes like that, but the key really to it is that you just need to be aware of hey, what these changes are. I had group submissions, so once I go ahead and submit my new 4.0, I basically moved all my group submissions into 4.0. So you can get some of this information, and we have a slide with what that is at the very end of the deck too as well. It'll be provided to you on some of those details. Obviously, you can do some research on the web too as well, or you can reach out to us at Reed Tech. The transition is definitely fairly smooth from at least the way I see it, technically speaking, but there are some things you do want to consider. And the other thing that we haven't touched on yet is the two-way communication piece. It's come up quite a bit. It's not here yet. But what we do see is the ability for that to be supported with the 4.0 specification. So, for instance, in the 3.2 world, if you needed to make a change to some of your metadata, you had to submit a whole new sequence in order to do that, and you had to withdraw the one that had the metadata change, add the new one back. Those kind of document title changes, keyword changes now can be done live. So those are moved from sort of a handing of a baton back and forth towards something that facilitates much more of a two-way interaction. And you can obviously support, in the same way you did, rolling submissions, which also is sort of the same thing. Provide me the data when you have it available. Let's talk about it, and then update it as we see fit along the way. So we see that being enabled. Not being focused on yet. There's enough changes, which I believe is the correct way to proceed there. Just let's get sort of used to the flexibility of 4.0 and the power it brings, and the challenges that we need to overcome in order to support it. And then once we have that in play and running smooth, then I definitely do see a future that moves much more towards real-time interaction with the regulatory authorities, which is really exciting, because that's when you really, where I at least really think we're going to see a huge decrease in the time it takes to get an application to approval once it's submitted.
Okay, great. So as Jim mentioned, there's a few things to consider as we move forward in this implementation, some challenges and some benefits. Obviously, as Jim mentioned, streamlining the regulatory submission process is beneficial both to the reviewers as well as the sponsors from both the time and cost savings. It will also advance lifecycle management and help streamline that process. And having a unified format for multiple agencies, regions, that's always been the concept of eCTD, as we know, but 4.0 has been in the works for many years, and it's always been the aim to further increase that unified format. There are some things to consider, though, in regards to challenges as we move forward, and that is, and I believe Jim mentioned this at some point, with all of the new keywords, context groups, unique identifiers, things like that. It's going to become really important to have a great way to track your metadata, your user-defined vocabulary, as you make this transition, just to make sure that you're keeping it consistent as you progress throughout the life cycle of your application. Another important item would be to ensure that you train your internal teams to the technology and concepts well in advance and continue to refresh as we get closer to the mandatory dates. And having a regulatory partner that offers regulatory consulting is a great way to do that. And then also just keep in mind that support for 3.2.2 will continue until 4.0 is universally mandatory, which we're going to take a look at that. As you can see here, it may be up until 2028 for some regions, but just like guidelines, they change pretty rapidly. So we do have an updated slide if you want to advance one, please, Gary. So some of the latest ones continue. Can you go to the next slide, Gary, please? Thank you. Some of the latest implementation is now well into 2029. So you'll see here that there are quite a few years for us to prepare for this, but 2024 is when the U.S. will begin offering voluntary submissions, and shortly thereafter in 2025, other countries follow suit for the voluntary. So it's great that we're preparing now, we're attending webinars, we're all learning about this because it will be quickly upon us. So this is just the most recent, and this just recently changed to push some of these dates out. So keeping up on the regulations and guidelines as we progress is definitely important to do. So next slide. Okay,
Great. Thank you so much, Adrienne. So our poll question number 3 is not quite a traditional poll question. We're going to ask you all to put in the question or chat section what regions you will be submitting eCTD to. And this just helps us determine what to best present to you guys in future webinars, where we should be focusing our knowledge share so we can see sort of where the market share is. So we'll give that just a few seconds. If you wouldn't mind just dropping in the chat what regions you'll be looking into. Okay. Thank you everyone for participating in that. And I'm going to jump right into poll question number 4. So you'll see here on your screen, do you currently have an eCTD publishing or regulatory consulting solution? You'll see the options there. Yes, Reed Tech. Yes, another service. No, or I'm not sure. So again, we'll leave this open another 10 seconds or so to let everyone get a chance to answer. And while we're here, you can keep utilizing the chat box till the end of the webinar if you wanted to share information about your regions and didn't have a chance to yet, or just if you have another question for us. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And Adrienne, can you explain to us a little bit more now possibly about Reed Tech's eCTD solution?
Right, absolutely. Thanks, Erin. So yeah, in addition to some of the regulatory consulting that I mentioned earlier, which we're happy to do if you have any questions regarding the 4.0 or any of your other regulatory needs, we do provide eCTD publishing services. And in that process, here I've outlined on the screen, I won't walk through the entire process on how we publish, but you can see here a few of the things that we do offer to our clients in that publishing process would be access to a viewing tool. We do publish using the Lorenz tool, so it is easy to transfer a project from one eCTD provider to another. We do use Smartsheet as a project planning tool, so along with eCTD publishing, we provide a very robust project management and project planning aspect to it. We do provide a client dashboard which concatenates all information regarding your applications into one area, including metrics such as how many applications, how many sequences, how many files or different countries, you name it, we can customize the dashboard to fit your needs. So we do use a secure file transfer tool as well as latest PDF preparation tools to make your submission compliant and your document submission ready. So we can, in addition to transferring and performing lifecycle on existing projects, we can act as a complement to an existing eCTD project. If you have a need for staff augmentation, things like that, we're happy to provide that as well. Long-term lifecycle support. And then just kind of that end-to-end regulatory services. The way that this eCTD services group came about is that we provide SPL conversion services to probably many of you, as well as a lot in the industry. And the clients were always asking Reed Tech, do you have eCTD publishing services? And it was just something that they didn't offer at the time. And that's really how our group came to be at Reed Tech, so that we can really kind of be that end-to-end solution for all of your needs. So again, last but not least, the consulting services, both from a publishing and eCTD standpoint, all the way up to GMP inspections, things like that. So please reach out if you have any questions. I'm sure there's no small ask, no ask too big either. We're happy to find a solution. So I will pass it off, I think, to Jim for some of our additional services.
Yes, thank you, Adrienne. As you mentioned, end-to-end is where we're at. So just want to mention a few other things that we do around the labeling space too as well, and quality. And so as many of you probably do know, Reed Tech has been in the SPL space for quite a while. So we do provide structured product label conversions, the XML formatting needed to meet the regulations. We have an expert staff and offer all of those submission services that are needed to guide manufacturers and distributors of drug and biological products through that process. We've been doing that for quite a while. So that is something that is sort of like one of those things that we do in our sleep. From there too as well, we can act as a U.S. agent, facilitating any communication that's needed with foreign establishments and the FDA. We also offer quality consulting and regulatory consulting services. So end-to-end services helping our customers navigate all the complexities of this changing environment, some of which we just obviously dove into today. Making sure that everybody's products are safe, effective, and compliant with all those regulations globally. We also provide some drug label research tools and analytics, so being able to really dig into labeling information that's been posted by the EU and the FDA in order to do some research to understand what other people's labels are looking like when you're working in the same indication, to really help you understand how you need to build the content you need to for what you're working on, and how to cross-reference what's already been out there. And then finally, when it comes to labeling, yes, there's the need in the U.S. to get things into XML format, but there's also the need on the other side of the world to get that XML data back into more traditionally paper-oriented publishing or electronic media publishing format. So anything for print to media, for advertising, for medical guides, for package inserts, product web pages, so taking that XML and basically publishing it back to multiple different formats that are needed in order to relay that format to whomever needs to consume it besides the regulatory agency. So these are some of the other services that we do provide around the pharmaceutical space, and we're happy to discuss with anybody any of these particular activities, any challenges that you might have. Over here at Reed Tech, we are most definitely happy to be an ear to listen to what some of the challenges are you have, and can take our experts that really do have a wide breadth of experience and do what we can do to help you through those challenges. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Erin.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you, Jim and Adrienne and Gary, for sharing your knowledge with us today. I know we've been getting a ton of questions coming in from our customers about eCTD version 4.0, so hopefully we've answered many of those for you today. If you do have any additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. You can reach us at pharma@reedtech.com or 215-557-3010. You see that information up there on your screen. Also, please remember to follow us on LinkedIn, X, and YouTube to see our latest content. And I also would encourage everyone to sign up for our monthly newsletters so you can hear the latest and greatest coming out of LexisNexis Reed Tech. We thank everyone for joining us today. We hope that the information that you learned was valuable, and we look forward to connecting again. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye-bye.